Welcome to yet again another deck spotlight video. The meta has been ramping up as decks have been figured out left and right. One deck that has taken everybody by storm is E.T.C Warrior. Even though the meta is ever changing, players have been hitting top 10 legend, sometimes even rank 1 with this variant of Warrior. So what makes this Warrior deck so strong, and why is it taking over the whole ladder system? In this video, we're going to be taking a look at and answering all of these questions. However, before we get into the good stuff, have you subscribed yet? If you want to keep up to date with all of the latest madness at the Darkmoon Faire, you should definitely subscribe to the Tempo Strategy channel. Not to mention, we have the best and greatest content when it comes to any of your favorite strategy-based games, Shadowverse, Hearthstone, and even Legends of Runeterra. Enough with the chit-chat, it's time to see what E.T.C has been jamming to. E.T.C Warrior has gone through quite a bit of name changes in its short existence. It started off as OTK Warrior, some players have simply called it a variant of Control Warrior, but for the purpose of this video, we think E.T.C Warrior is the most appropriate name for this deck. It centers around a control style of gameplay in which it utilizes Warrior's draw power, armor gain, and removal in order to survive long enough in order to execute its one-turn kill combo. Since Warrior is the strongest class in mass removal and life sustain, this deck is an insane anti-aggro deck, beating most aggressive decks such as Tempo Demon Hunter. It also has some strong potential against other control decks since it has an inherent OTK that can kill players upwards of the full 30 life players start with. Now, one of the main focuses of this deck is this OTK we've been mentioning. Here is exactly how it works. You utilize these cards: E.T.C, God of Metal, Penflinger, Animated Broomstick, and 2 copies of Bloodsworn Mercenary. First, you summon E.T.C, God of Metal, Penflinger your E.T.C, then copy it with 2 copies of Bloodsworn Mercenary, and after all of that, play Animated Broomstick and rush the minions in dealing 6 damage at a time to your opponent. It's pretty simple the first time you do it, but we figured we should explain it to those who haven't quite seen it just yet. If your E.T.C's live when attacking, the combo will deal 42 damage, and if they die, you'll deal 36. You may be asking yourself, how do I win if they don't play minions? Well, it's a bit complicated, but it'll depend on the matchup you're facing. Don't tunnel vision too hard on the OTK, as your win condition is matchup dependent. Speaking of matchups, why don't we take a look at how different matchups vary? As we mentioned earlier, this deck is fairly strong against any aggressive strategy. Demon hunters, rogues, and shamans all can have a very difficult time dealing with all of the life gain and removal this warrior deck has. This is why some players consider it to be a simple control warrior deck. It runs a lot of similar cards to that of a traditional warrior, cards like Bladestorm, Brawl, and even Lord Barav. Another benefit this deck has against aggressive styles is that it doesn't need to save the OTK combo. It can use its pieces freely to fight for board when needed. For example, players can generate massive amounts of armor with the traditional combo of Risky Skipper, Armorsmith, and Bloodsworn Mercenary. This combo alone deals with all sorts of wide boards and can generate enough armor to outgain any kind of burst from your opponents. When it comes to control mid-range matchups, it becomes more interesting. Some of them are fairly good to even matchups, whereas others are just almost unwinnable. The matchups that are close are decks that can't really interfere with your combo or gain enough life total to outlive the combo. These control mid-range decks would also include classes like Druid, Shaman, and even Paladin. However, where it gets dicey for this particular warrior deck is when it encounters matchups like Priest or another variation of Control Warrior. These matchups are so bad just because of a couple factors. Priest is an abysmal matchup and probably one of the worst just because of one card, Mindrender Elusia. This card, if it hits any relevant card, makes your entire strategy useless. You can no longer OTK them, and good luck ever trying to win on value or removal. It's simply not possible. Typically, the other way to win without relying on the combo is copying Rattlegore and hoping that it is enough to get a player there. This will never fly against Priest. Priest has cards like Cabal Acolyte and Wave of Apathy, along with Plague of Death. Let's just say that Rattlegore will never be on your side of the board for longer than the turn you actually play it. The other matchup we mentioned was Control Warrior. Control Warriors can gain out of the life range that is needed for you to be able to kill your opponent, and have also been teching in Silence in order to make sure that they don't ever lose to Rattlegore. If it's a Bomb Control Warrior, they also sometimes can kill you before you really get anything going yourself, and that's the main reason some control decks can be a struggle to play against for E.T.C Warrior. Now, here is one matchup that takes a lot of intricacies and is one of the weirder matchups you'll experience if you decide to play this deck. One rule of thumb that we've determined from playing mirror matches is to make sure that you are the first one to play Rattlegore or tech in some form of Rattlegore removal. Players will never really be able to kill their opponent because of how much life gain both sides have, so it all comes down to sticking the best minion that players have in their deck, Rattlegore. If you can stick the first Rattlegore and your opponent has nothing for it, you can then make copies of it with Bloodsworn Mercenary Legendary and coast to victory since your opponent will struggle to deal with any copies of that card in the first place. This strategy gets used quite a bit even in matchups that aren't the mirror. However, it is especially important in the mirror match because both players should never really die to the ETC combo. We also mentioned earlier that players can tech their decks in order to prevent this from happening. Some players have included a copy of Ironbeak Owl, while some players have included a copy of Silas Darkmoon in order to just straight up take their opponent's Rattlegore. These two cards alone mean if played properly, and your opponent isn't running either of those cards, you will be able to win the matchup single-handedly. The mulligans for this deck aren't that straightforward, but there are some general rules of thumb. Against all matchups, you want to keep cards like Evil Quartermaster, Angar, and sometimes even Shield Block. Against aggressive decks, you want to try and look for Risky Skipper, Armorsmith, and even Animated Broomstick. Against control decks, it's best to try and keep as much card draw as possible. Last, for the mirror, it is extremely important to only look for Rattlegore or your own answer to Rattlegore if you are running any. These mulligans are a pretty basic and good guide overall. There will be some times where it seems beneficial to keep specific combinations of cards in specific matchups. For example, maybe keeping Shield Slam and Shield Block together when you know you're playing against a more aggressive deck will generally be a good idea. This deck has tons of strengths and weaknesses, some of which are obvious and others may not be as obvious as some players may think. Strengths include the ability to bully aggressive decks while having a flexible win condition. We could say that the vast majority of your games will not end in OTKing your opponent from 30 life. The vast majority of your games will have to decide when to commit resources early and when to hold them back against particular matchups. This means that the deck has a fairly high skill ceiling and will reward players who are more proficient and have put more time into the deck. As for weaknesses, the two glaring ones are that it has some matchups that are virtually unwinnable, and the OTK does rely on your opponent playing minions. For the vast majority of games, you will never resort to the combo being needed, but against particular matchups, you will have no choice but to try and attempt using your full combo to kill your opponent from 30. This is where your opponent can be very sneaky, and when they sense you are getting close to assembling your damage, they can just not play a minion in order to prevent you from ever doing the full damage. This is something that may come up more and more as players begin to figure out the deck and how to play against it. This deck is extremely powerful, so powerful that it's regarded as one of the best decks in the game currently. Will this continue to be? We aren't really sure. It definitely has the potential to stay around the meta for quite some time, but it also has its unique flaws that could result in its downfall, and time will tell with this deck. We hope you enjoyed our look at E.T.C Warrior. If you did, be sure to let us know in the comments below. If there's a deck you're having trouble with, be sure to tell us and maybe we'll make a deck spotlight for it. As for now, remember to like the video and subscribe to the Tempo Strategy channel for more of the latest and greatest Hearthstone content. And until next time, keep rocking out with E.T.C at the Darkmoon Faire.